Good morning. Last week we didn't quite finish, so I'm going to decided to go back and complete that lesson. We had good discussion last week, and I was also preparing for the coming weeks. And while I was preparing, I came across the Olivet Discourse, which is in chapter 24, and it contains a little bit into chapter 25. But as I was kind of looking at that and preparing for that, I was also reading, and I read lots of different articles. And I was reading about the eclipse. Has anybody read anything about the upcoming eclipse? Well, I'm going to kind of go through some things which I found were very interesting. And I began to put, kind of two and two together. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what I found. And specifically today, we'll look at three themes. We'll look at Jesus beginning his journey to Calvary and fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel. And then secondly, Jesus shows us what will happen in the future through the Olivet Discourse. And then finally, Jesus sends us a message of hope, but also for some people, it might be a little bit fearful. So I'm going to go through that. Hopefully we'll get through all of it. But let's take a look first at Jesus beginning his journey to Calvary and fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel. Now, as I said last time, Jesus has already told his disciples 3 times that he's going to die. And remember, we talked about why was he doing that? Why did he tell them over and over and over again that he was going to go to the cross? He was going to die.
For one, after his resurrection, they would realize it was all prophesied, that this was not an accident. This was not something that Jesus did not know, because in Luke's, one of the accounts of Luke, it says, and this was hidden from them. So Jesus not only told them, but God hid from them the understanding of all that was being said.
He had, but in fact, they were still going to go through, and he had told them 3 times, but they were still going to go through doubt, concern, all of those things. And then all of a sudden, something miraculous would happen. What was that?
Resurrection.
Jesus appeared to them in his resurrected self. So we'll take a look at all of that. But Matthew explains a little bit about this. And in Matthew 21, first 3 verses tell us that Jesus sent 2 disciples to get a donkey. And you have to ask yourself, okay, why? Well, Matthew explains it in Matthew 20. Verse 4. Jack, can you read that?
He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right."
All right, so Matthew 20, verse 4. Is that where he told them to go get the donkeys, or is it 21? 21, I'm sorry. Jack, can you read verse 4 of 21?
Yes. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet.
Okay, where's the one about the donkey? Through 5. All right.
1 through 5.
Yeah, 2 through 5.
2.
Yeah, 2 through 5.
Saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied
There you
there,
go. That's
with
the
her
one.
colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone asks anything to you or says anything to you, tell him that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away."
Now, you have to realize that Jesus sent them to do something, but this is also a fulfillment of prophecy in Zechariah 9:9. I hope.
"Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle, and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey."
So this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Again, in Zechariah, Jesus prophesied that. Now, the disciples, they go ahead and do as Jesus told them, and all of a sudden, people are moving forward and laying their cloaks down. And you can see that this is a fulfillment of Daniel's 70-week prophecy, or 62 weeks plus 7 weeks, or 7 weeks plus 62, which is 69 weeks. Now, I want to go through the math a little bit on this, but can you read Daniel 9:24 through 27, Jack?
77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know and understand this: from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7 in the middle of the 7. He will put an end to the sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him.
All right, so let me go through this a little bit. He talks about 7 sevens and 62 sevens, which are 69 weeks. Now, I want to do the math very quickly for you. And if you want to, you can copy this. But essentially, we're talking about 7 times 69. Why do I say 7 times 69? Huh?
7 days.
All right, each week is 7 days, but actually they're talking about years, okay? So that's 483 years times 360 is 173,880 days. However, you've got to do something else. You have to take a look at Julian years. If you take a look at the clock, so that's 365.25 days. See, why? What's the difference between 360 and 365.25? Huh? No, it's not the leap year. 360 is what? The lunar year. Okay, so the lunar year. Okay, and they calculate by lunar, and eventually they would add an extra month. But 365.25, it leaves us with 476 years in 21 days. Okay, you following me so far? Okay. Uh-huh. Okay, the 70 versus 69. Anybody want to explain that?
He said that you have 69 years for your people, and then was the last 7 years for your people is probably the Great Tribulation.
Yes. So there are 69 years. Let me go through it and then we can address any questions. But King Artaxerxes of Persia gave the order to rebuild between March 4th and April 1st of 444 BC. Now, why is that important? Why is that important? Knowing when he gave the order to rebuild Jerusalem. Jack, can you read that again, the first part of that? It's in-
77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy.
Okay. So when is it, how do you count that 77? He gives us a indication. And it's from the time Artaxerxes gave the order to rebuild Jerusalem. Okay. And that was sometime between 3-4 and 4-1 of 444 BC. Following? All right, let me go on. That brings us to roughly 33 AD. Adding 21 days leaves Jesus' entry somewhere between March 23rd and April 22nd. Now, what typically happens sometime between March 23rd and April 22nd in the Jew?
Easter Sunday,
The Passover.
Passover.
The Passover. Interesting, right? Why would he enter during the Passover? I'm sorry, what? He's the lamb. Okay. Okay, he's the lamb. Okay. But why would he, what do you think Jerusalem was like at that time? It was absolutely packed, jam-packed. Okay, so guess what Passover is, by the way, in 2024? Anybody know? The 22nd of April. Okay, interesting. All right, so what we see is Jesus fulfilling prophecy to the T. So what happened next? Matthew 21, verses 8 through 11, Jack.
Hang on just a minute. Like Matthew 21, 8.
8 through 11.
Okay. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds then went ahead of him, and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee."
All right, now, who would have been asking, who is this? What do you guess? Who would have been asking, who is this? Who is this guy? Huh?
The Jews.
Jews, but I would say that they are visitors, some of whom are visiting from afar and hadn't heard some of the things that Jesus has been doing. So they're saying, who is this? What's going on here? What's happening here? And by the way, Jesus knows what's going to happen soon. He's going to be arrested. He's going to be mocked. He's going to be scourged. He's going to be crucified, and he's going to be separated from God. And of all of those things, what do you think was the worst for Jesus? Separation from God. You know, when it says on the cross, "I thirst," I don't think that was a physical thirst. I think it was a thirst and a desire to be with God. The person who had had perfect fellowship for all eternity was all of a sudden separated from God for our behalf. So he's not sneaking into Jerusalem, is he? He continues to move forward, and he continues to enter the city, and he does that quite publicly. Okay, can you see it? You know, we celebrate this on Palm Sunday, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. So this is called his triumphal entry. Hosanna to the Son of David. And remember, this was prophesied again by Daniel 570 years earlier. 570, can you imagine it? 570 years. And Daniel prophesied it. And not only prophesied it pretty much to the day. Not just the year, the day. Think about that. I think that's pretty awesome, but let's go on. A crowd forms, and they come together, and they lay down their clothes, and they shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Now, this is even before he enters Jerusalem, and they're quite excited. Why? What are they anticipating? Hosanna to the Son of David.
The king.
He's the king. And so some are asking who he is, but they shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David." So some knew who he was, and it was prophesied in Zechariah 9. And by the way, it means, Hosanna means what? Anybody know that? No, save now. Save now. And Jesus also picked an excellent time to enter the city because this was Passover, and there were many pilgrims there. What do I mean by pilgrims? What do I mean by? He was working to fulfill this prophecy, and this is called the triumphal entry. And it was, as one writer put it, a triumph of humility over pride, a triumph of poverty over affluence, and a triumph of meekness and gentleness over rage and malice. Okay, but why do I call them pilgrims?
Some did not live in Jerusalem and they had to go for the feast.
What do you mean they had to go?
They were required by Jewish law.
They're required. 3 pilgrimage feasts, Passover was one of them. And
Nice.
even people in the diaspora out in the world would come from as far away as Africa.
Which are the people who were probably asking, who is this? What's going on here? These are the pilgrimage feasts. Remember? Passover or Pesach, Pentecost or Shavuot, or Booths or Sukkot. Those are the three feasts where they have to be. They have to come. They were required to come. Okay? Yeah, Cheryl.
The fall feast, are they required also to come?
what?
In the fall feast, are they required to come
Well,
also?
what fall feast? Which one of these three are fall feasts? Booths or Sukkot. So they were required to come to those too. But that was really a celebration. Well, it starts with Rosh Hashanah, but then there are the 10 days of awe, and then there is what happens after those 10 days? What is it? The High Holy Day, Yom Kippur. Okay, and then after that, there are 7 days of celebration and living in booths. So Jesus decides he's gonna make his presence known. So what does he do? He enters the temple. Matthew 21, 12 and 13, Jack.
Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there.
Okay, so he's angry here because the merchants, with approval of the priests and really they're scamming the pilgrims and forcing them to buy sacrificial animals and trinkets at greatly inflated prices. And he cleansed the temple. Go ahead, Jack.
He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers.
See, I think right here, when he says, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. Who do you think he's talking to? Is he talking to the merchants? What do you think he's talking to?
He's talking to the high priestly family who had the responsibility and the authority to set up all this.
Yeah, I think he's talking to the priests. I think you're absolutely right, Alvin. The sellers couldn't have sold those animals without the priest's approval. And do you think the priests are getting a cut of the action? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So then after that, he turns to the blind and the lame in Matthew 21, verses 14 through 17.
The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did and the children shouting in the temple area, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant.
So the chief priests and the scribes aren't happy here. Not happy at all. And the response to Jesus' miracles was to be indignant. Go ahead, Jack.
Do you hear what these children are saying? They asked him. Yes, replied Jesus. Have you never read, from the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise? And he left them and went out of the city to Bethany, where he spent the night.
So it says he went to the city of Bethany and lodged there. Why would he have to go to Bethany to lodge? Well, think about the conditions of the city, the inns, the hotels, the places to stay. What do you think? They're all full. They're all packed. They're all packed. We're going with the family to Florida to watch Joshua play baseball, which we don't think he's going to be able to play. He's got to have surgery. But Gigi, what was your experience trying to find a hotel room?
Oh, well, if I waited too long, if all of a sudden it said sold out, like, wow. 'cause
So
it's-
everything's sold out. Okay, same thing with the Passover, right? And Marvin.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, when Jesus was in that city, he always went to Bethany to stay at Lazarus, Mary and Martha's house. They were good friends. He stayed there. It was only 2 miles away, so he had a place to stay.
So it's a 20-30 minute walk at most. Gigi.
Before you move on, I had heard somebody talking about the triumphal entry, and that he was sitting on a colt that had never been ridden. So those generally are not tame.
Yeah, how many people have ever tried to ride a horse that has never been ridden? What's that like, Don?
People were shouting and waving things in front of this donkey, and he just rode. I mean, Jesus has control over everything, and just rode peacefully into the city. Which
I mean, that's miraculous. It's miraculous, is it not? Thanks for bringing that up. But effectively, it's not an easy chore to ride an animal who's never been ridden before, yet Jesus did it smoothly. And then on the first day, he's already stirred up Jerusalem. And on the next day, he continues this in Matthew 21, 18, 19, Jack.
Early in the morning, as he was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." Immediately, the tree withered.
I love it that it says, well, Jesus was hungry. He's ready for breakfast, right? He's a breakfast guy. And they're talking about Jesus' appetite here. And I think, among other things, Jesus likes food. Okay, did you ever think about that? Jesus likes food. In fact, it's one of the first things he asked for after the resurrection. Luke 24, 41 through 42.
And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence.
You know, how many of you know who Cardinal Dolan is? Who is he, Bobby? You know? Cardinal. He's a cardinal in New York. And he is conservative, and he's a voice for Catholicism, pretty much in our country. But he was telling a story about when he was ordained as a bishop, and the other bishop came to him and talked to him a little bit and said, you know, normally, if you know anything about Cardinal Dolan, he's a big, robust kind of guy, likes food. And so they asked him, what's your favorite verse? He said, well, I've got one, but I don't know if you're going to be able to use it. He said, why? He said, well, it was after Jesus' resurrection when he asked him, does anybody have anything to eat around here? He said, they didn't use that one, but I got a kick out of that. Anyway, Jesus curses the tree. No fruit comes. It's not going to grow again. And this is also, by the way, figs are symbolic of what? Fig trees are symbolic of what? Israel. And they're symbolic of Israel. And Israel was unfruitful, and Jesus was talking about their coming judgment. And in verse 20 through 22, it tells us the disciples were impressed, and they asked him, how did he do it? How'd you do this? And essentially, what are they conveying here, these disciples? I mean, just imagine you're with Jesus, and there's this beautiful bushy tree right over here. You see it before, and then all of a sudden you see that after. What are you thinking?
This is the guy that's been healing people. Why is he killing the tree?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. What else would it do, though? Jack?
Well, I want to go back to the food, the hunger after resurrection. I think that's to show his humanity.
Oh, yeah,
His
sure.
spirit. He was just like that. He was a human being resurrected from the grave. This verse bothers me. I don't know the spiritual significance of it.
You don't know the significance. Well, how about anybody else? Anybody else? Look at everybody looking at me. Well, you're the teacher.
I would like to know what Alvin thinks about it, because I kind of looked to Alvin as the biblical expert in the room, right next to you, of course.
Well, the tree was fruitful in that it produced leaves, but there were no figs. There was no fruit. And so essentially Jesus, like Israel, had no fruit. And he said, he destroyed it. He said, boom, you're done.
That's a believer who doesn't have fruit. Is he condemned to hell?
No. And I don't think he's condemned to hell, but in fact, it was unfruitful. And I think the story there is that if you're unfruitful, okay, we're done. Let's move on. And essentially that, I think, is what Jesus is doing with his disciples. Yes.
Okay.
Footnote in my Bible, it says, why did Jesus curse the fig tree? This was not a thoughtless, angry act, but an acted out parable. Jesus was showing his anger at religion without substance. Just as the fig tree looked good from a distance, but was fruitless on close examination. So the temple looked impressive at first glance, but its sacrifices and other activities were hollow because they were not done to worship God sincerely.
So essentially what they're talking about is Israel was unfruitful. Their leaders were unfruitful, and he's making commentary on that. Okay, other questions, comments, snide remarks, additions? Yeah, Bart.
John 15 shows how important fruit is as a sign of genuine life.
Yeah.
Jesus says, if except you abide in me, you don't bear any fruit. If you don't bear any fruit, you're gonna be cut off and thrown away, like we do a fig tree.
And what Jesus essentially is saying is, I'm going to expose you. Here you go. Yeah.
I was gonna say, it's just like the parable of the vineyard where the vineyard owner sends his son and the leaders of the vineyard or the managers of the vineyard say, here's the son, let's kill him, let's take him. But he came because they weren't producing the fruit that they want. Just like Israel, the leaders, they were entrusted to the people, but they weren't bearing the fruit, and God was going to cut them off and give it to somebody else that was going to bear fruit. And I think that's why, you know, the Israelite or the Gentile, the time for the Gentiles came as a result of this. Is a prophecy that kind of goes to.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Real quickly, then we have to move on.
So, yeah, I didn't finish. So if you only appear to have faith without putting it to work in your life, you're like the fig tree that withered and died because it bore no fruit.
That's good. You're having trouble reading that, huh? Tom? How many people used readers? Well, Jesus then, his dialogue with the priests and elders continues, and they try hard to trap him. Matthew 21:23 through 27, Jack.
Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked.
Now, hold on a second, Jack. He's in the middle of teaching, okay? And they confront him. I believe they interrupted him, but he wasn't intimidated by them at all. I mean, he had just cleansed the temple, and I assume they interrupted him with this question. So Jesus asked them a question. Go ahead, Jack.
And who gave you this authority? Jesus replied, I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or from men?
Uh-oh.
They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, we are afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. Then he said, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things.
So they don't answer him. He won't answer them. And did this do anything for relations with the priests and the Sadducees and the scribes? Do you think it enhanced it? I don't think so. But, you know, think about this. You want to trick or get in a debate with Jesus? Good luck with that. Yeah.
It made them even angrier too, so might have tried to lynch him right there.
Well, they would have, except for everybody believed he was at least a prophet, if not the Messiah. So they weren't going to do that in public. They'd do it behind closed doors, but they weren't going to do it in public. And after this, in verses 28 through 41, Jesus tells us two parables. First, the parable of the two sons who refused to obey, they refused to repent, and he used this to show how the Pharisees and Sadducees refused to listen to John and eventually rejoiced when Herod killed him. Now, here's the interesting thing about it is that the people were saying that John was a prophet. The Pharisees and Sadducees knew that. He had prophesied some things, and they had occurred. And what's interesting about it is Jesus had just performed miracles in front of them. And they were so bound up in their hate for Jesus that they never considered who he was or who he might even be. Why is that? How does that hate blind you? Do you ever think about that? Can hate blind you?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. How so? Hate is really self-centered, isn't it? Why do I say that? Why do I say hate is self-centered? I'm the one holding it, but I'm mad. I hate somebody because they have offended me. Okay? So I'm going to be mad at them sometimes for the rest of my life. And who does that affect adversely? The other person? Absolutely not. It eats people up. And I've told you the story about a brother of mine who is still mad at my father, even though he's been dead for about 10 or 15 years. Okay. And he just is a bitter person. And it ate him up. And it made him madder and madder and madder. And I told him one time, I said, Joe, give him a break. And when he was 84, he told me how he told my father. I said, he's 84 years old. Leave him alone. That wasn't sufficient. Any of you have any family like that? And essentially, that hate just eats people up. I'm sorry?
Affects so much of their life,
Oh, yeah.
that bitterness eats away at everything.
And then you've got the parable of the wicked servants and the landowner who had a vineyard, okay? And he finally sent his son. He had sent several servants, and they harassed him, and he sent his son, and they killed him. And again, there's a parallel here, isn't it? A foreshadowing. God sent his only son to us. And what did? We killed him. And then finally, Jesus talks directly to his disciples in Matthew 21, verses 42 to 46, Jack.
Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, quote, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone? The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes.
This is from Psalm 118, by the way. Go ahead.
Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. He who falls on this stone will be broken into pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed.
So what is he saying here? He's warning them that if they or anybody else stumble over or reject Jesus, they'll be crushed by the rock. And the priests and the Pharisees knew that the parables were about them, and they looked for a way to arrest him. Go ahead, Jack.
When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet.
And some held that he was Messiah. But I was thinking, why were they even still there? Why were the priests and Pharisees still there? I mean, Jesus had called them hypocrites, a brood of vipers, had done all of those things. And I mean, he shut them down every time they addressed him. Why were they still there? Matthew 12, 38 through 41, Jack.
Then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, Teacher, we want to see a miraculous sign from you. He answered, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign.
Now, wait a minute. He calls them a wicked and adulterous generation. And he also, by the way, will end that way. And here they are back again watching him. Go ahead, Jack.
But none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth.
Now, I started studying Jonah. And Jesus was really setting up eventually what would happen. And he was alerting his disciples. He was attacking the Pharisees and Sadducees. He didn't like their religious practices that were actually contrary to God's intent. And he told them so. He was not intimidated. He would be the guy that you'd want to be with when you're taking on an army. He didn't back down. Now, I want to go to the Olivet Discourse for a minute, where Jesus told us something that may be relevant to us today. Now, I'm going to cover this in a more in-depth manner next week, but let's look for a moment at Matthew 24, verse 29.
Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken.
All right, now, I want to focus on the sun being darkened. Do you believe that God gives us signs in the skies?
Yes.
Do you believe? I remember there are some people, astronomers, who can tell you about the gospel written into the skies. So I want to use Jesus' examples, and I want to go back to Jonah 1:1. Jack, can you read that?
The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great, just one, right?
Yeah, 1:1.
Just one. Okay. So the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai.
Okay, word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Okay, read verse 2.
Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me.
All right, God wanted Jonah to go to Nineveh, but he didn't. He didn't want to do that. So where does he go? He flees to Tarshish, which is in the opposite direction. Tarshish is 2,500 miles away from where he is, and Nineveh is 500 miles. Okay, so God tells him to go to Nineveh. He goes the other way. At least for a while, he went the other way. Now I want to take a look at some of this eschatology. What's eschatology? What's that? What's that mean? What's that mean? Go ahead, guys. What's that?
It's a study of end times. Like
Study of end times, okay? There's a reason we're beginning with Jonah, and I'm going to reveal that later, okay? So we see here that God is not pleased with the Assyrians, okay? That's who, by the way, occupied Nineveh, right? Nineveh was the center of Assyrian headquarters, for lack of a better description, okay? Well, what did they do wrong? Can you read that, Jack?
There are several possible reasons for Jonah's desire to see Nineveh destroyed. First, Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria, a ruthless and warlike people who were enemies of Israel. Nineveh's destruction would have been seen as a victory for Israel. Second, Jonah probably wanted to see Nineveh's downfall to satisfy his own sense of justice. After all, Nineveh deserved God's judgment. Third, God's withholding of judgment from Nineveh could have made Jonah's words appear illegitimate, since he had predicted the city's destruction. So what were the sins of the Assyrians?
So let's take a look real quickly. Here is, by the way, Assyria. Their empire was massive. You could see at the top there. Okay, and effectively, this is Tarshish, 2,500 miles away. Here is the road to Nineveh, which is 500 miles. Okay, you take a look at that. Here's Israel, Jerusalem, Joppa, and Judah. Okay, well, let's take a look at the sins. Jack, can you read that?
God allowed the brutal Assyrian army to destroy several Israelite cities, including Lachish. Their king, Sennacherib, had a reputation for brutality, and the people of Lachish suffered horribly when their city fell. As many as 50,000 people were tortured and killed. Based on archaeological findings, we know that the Assyrians often beheaded, burned, flayed, and impaled their victims.
Can you imagine that? Go ahead, Jack.
The few prisoners that were taken by Assyria were led along by rings pierced through their lips. They worshiped the sun, moon, stars, and their main god was Ashur, and main goddess was Ishtar, but they also had the sins of idolatry, murder, sexual perversion, and prostitution, child sacrifice, human trafficking, witchcraft, and more.
So really, really, it sounds like today, doesn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah, absolutely. So as more advanced the world gets, the more decadent. And here we go. And let's take a look at Ishtar for a minute. She's the goddess of evil, okay, or the goddess of love, sex, war, and a symbol in support of abortion. Now, a statue of Ishtar was put up in New York in a park and on top of a courthouse, okay? And she recently resurfaced again at the University of Houston. But it was taken down after pro-life students protested. All right, so this stuff is going on a consistent basis. And there were plenty of reasons why God was not pleased with Nineveh. The Assyrians were terrible. And there are lots of versions of Ishtar, but essentially, what does that say? Not so much about Nineveh, not so much about the Assyrians, but what does that say about God? Remember, what was God sending Jonah to Nineveh for? What purpose was he sending him? He was sending him to what?
Save them.
So what does that say about God? Look at the midst of this sin and corruption and filth, and yet God has a heart for them, a merciful heart. Jack.
You notice, and if you look at history, it seems like the ultimate depravity, for some reason, and we see that today, as you just said, includes and is specifically a hatred of Israel.
Yeah.
And you can see that in
It's getting worse.
Yeah, in the evil of our times, it seems like that those evil people in their most depraved thoughts are hatred of Jews and Israel. I mean, we saw that when Hamas went in and killed those people, and the atrocities are exactly what you're describing here.
And yet we're denying that even happened. Yeah.
It's interesting that even though the people in Nineveh repented, and Jonah was not happy about that, but 100 years later, we find out what the status is. They've gone right back to their own ways, because they whom the prophet speaks against Nineveh specifically, and they have gone back to all of the very sins that they had repented of when Jonah went.
Well, you know, we think that the Nineveh and the Ninevites were atrocious. But is America any different? Take a look at this. I did a little bit of research on this as well. All right, I did a little bit of research here, and I want to share it with you. Abortion: over 65 million babies have been sacrificed since 1973. In 2021, 26,031 murders were committed in the U.S. Idolatry, atheism, easy believism, sports, food, material success, education, beauty, porn, politics, cars, children, family, anything that's put in the place of God. And that happens frequently in our society. Violent crime, gun assaults up 42%, aggravated assault up 8%, carjackings up 93% since 1919. Violent crime, or 2019. Some 1,476,000 violent crimes occurred in the U.S. in 2022. Prostitution, 80,000 were arrested and are arrested annually. And that's a small sampling. For example, in Las Vegas alone, where prostitution is legal, 3,500 prostitutes and 2.4 million customers. Can you imagine that? And that's just a sliver of the numbers that exist in the U.S. Human trafficking. It's 100. How many people saw the movie on human trafficking? $150 billion industry worldwide. 25 million victims. In the U.S. alone, between 100,000 and 300,000 women and children are forced into sexual slavery. Pornography. That industry generates well over 100 billion per year. 12% of all internet sites have pornography. And strip clubs. Look at this. Nationwide, there are 4,000 strip clubs at least that we can count. And they use over 400,000 women. So is America any different than Nineveh? And that's stuff that we know about. Just imagine the stuff that we don't know about. Well, let's go back to Jonah a little bit. Because it's important to take a look at this data, but it's important also not to be discouraged by that data. So the question is, what gods might we be worshiping? Lots of different ones. Now, as we move on, keep in mind that Jesus' comments regarding darkness and signs in the sky from the Olivet Discourse. Keep that in mind. Okay, and I want to go to something else. Now, the same eclipse, which is the Bur-Sagali eclipse, coming in April, also occurred in June 15th of 763 BC, covering 98.7% of the sun from Nineveh. And after that, after this eclipse, they had a revolt, a peasant revolt, and a plague. Now, Jeroboam II was king of Israel. And that was when Jonah went to Nineveh sometime between 773 and 755. And Nineveh was clearly wicked, but to them, an eclipse was viewed as a dark sign and a warning for the Assyrians. Okay. Now, did Jonah arrive post-eclipse? Probably. Many believe that, quite frankly, this eclipse is why Nineveh repented so quickly and easily for Jonah. Now, how many of you have ever read this story and thought, well, they repented pretty easily? Have you ever thought about that? Have any of you ever thought about that? Well, that's probably why. And that's what I'm guessing. So I want to fast forward to our present day as we anticipate another eclipse on April 8th. April 8th is when the eclipse is coming. How many of you have read about that at all? Okay, so that's April 8th. Let's take a look at it. Can you read that Bible verse from Joel, Jack?
The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes.
All right, now realize that the moon during an eclipse appears to be red. So that may be what Jesus is talking about, or Joel is talking about, the moon turned to blood. And there have actually been 2 eclipses that are going to have, that crossed our country and they intersected. And now I want to look at something interesting and some interesting data that may have implications for us. The solar eclipse is coming on 4/8/24. Now, I want to know, are these things a coincidence? There was a solar eclipse that happened in 2017 called the Salem eclipse. Now, it was the Bur-Sagali eclipse, but it's also called the Salem eclipse. And it started in Salem, Oregon, and it touched 7 cities named Salem, including Salem, Oregon, Salem, Idaho, Salem, Wyoming, Salem, Nebraska, Salem, Missouri, Salem, Kentucky, and Salem, South Carolina. Okay, the Salem eclipse. And these are high points where it's darkest. Okay, now this coming eclipse, let's see if there's anything significant about this. It's called the Nineveh eclipse. And it's going to touch 7 cities in the U.S. named Nineveh, including Nineveh, Texas, Nineveh, Missouri, Nineveh, Indiana, Nineveh, in Ohio, Nineveh, Pennsylvania, Nineveh, Virginia, and Nineveh, New York. And by the way, it's also going to touch another city in Nova Scotia named Nineveh. Now, officially, it's called the Bur-Sagali. But what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Do you think God's telling us anything? Yes.
Another point about it is there were 7 in the last eclipse, 7 years since that eclipse, 7 this eclipse, and where they cross, there's a city that's called Rapture.
Well, we're gonna show you where they cross in a minute, but there's a couple other things that are happening right away. The 17 and 13-year cicadas are going to come out in April of this year. They're going to come out together, which is the first time, and the last time that happened was when Thomas Jefferson was president. Okay, so they're going to come out. cicadas, locusts, who knows? Okay, now let's take a look at some more here because I found this. How many of you find this fascinating? I was just blown away by this. They're going to cross in a place, Marvin, you know about this, called Little Egypt in Carbondale or near Carbondale. Okay, and Jack, can you read that?
The paths of the two eclipses form a transcontinental X. In a strange coincidence, the only spot in the path of both eclipses receiving a double dose of this modern plague of darkness and the point of the longest duration for both eclipses is a particular part of southern Illinois known appropriately enough as Little Egypt. The Egyptian connection is so strong that there are several cities in the area named for ancient Egyptian places like Karnak, Cairo, and Thebes.
Do I have your attention yet? You know, I was looking at, well, why is it called Little Egypt? And evidently, the origin of their name is they provided grain, and it's a very fertile area, but they provided grain for northern Illinois after a horrible winter, and it was in 1831 and 1832. Coincidence? Let me go on. Here's where it crosses. You see the intersection right there? And that is Little Egypt, okay? Now, what's interesting is that that's right kind of in the middle of the New Madrid Fault. Now, what I didn't know when I was doing my research is that the New Madrid Fault, everybody talks about the San Andreas Fault. Where is that San Andreas Fault? California, okay. This is, New Madrid Fault is 6 times the size of the San Andreas Fault. And this is, Little Egypt is right in the middle of the New Madrid Fault. In 2008, FEMA reported that an earthquake here could result in one of the highest, if not the highest, economic loss ever. And in April 1811, an earthquake of do you realize 8.0? An earthquake of 8.0 was so strong that it reversed the flow of the Mississippi temporarily and rang bells in Boston. You imagine that? Rang bells in Boston. All right. And we think we're powerful. Yeah, Don.
They said that the land at that time rippled like waves on an ocean. They said it was just so bad. I mean, and one of the things on the backup is created Real Brook Lake down in Tennessee. I mean, it's just been fantastic.
Yeah.
And by the way, do you like my little artwork there? Did all of you hear that? Good.
I-65 will be a mess, stay away.
Another reason why I-65 is going to be a mess. That's good. All right, now I want to show you something else, which is really interesting. All right, these are Greek letters. Jack, can you read that verse in Revelation 22?
Behold, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give to everyone according to what he has done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end.
All right, so this is the sign for the Alpha and Omega. How many of you were in a fraternity? Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, mu, nu, xi, omicron, pi, phi. What was the last one? Anyway, we had to memorize the Greek alphabet. But anyway, Linda, you had your hand up earlier.
Backing up a bit. I'm gonna imagine why all of these students, earlier showing 7 of them, named themselves Nineveh. What's the history of that?
What were you thinking? I'm with you, Linda. I have no idea, but I didn't want to do the history on that too. But I question that myself. All right. So you take a look at this. This is the Alpha and the Omega. And who's the Alpha and the Omega? Jesus. Okay. Jesus is clearly identifying himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the warrior, the one who's going to come back in his glory. I love that picture. And oh, the warrior will conquer all. The world would fall before his feet. That's from a song that my son sang. All right, now here is what we call the old Paleo Hebrew, okay? And alpha in Greek, it's alpha. In Hebrew, it's aleph, okay? And you see the Hebrew versus the old Hebrew, okay? And the omega here is tav. So aleph, tav, the alpha and the omega. And you see the Roman alphabet and the old Paleo Hebrew together, okay? You got that? The alpha and the omega. Now, I want to go on just a little bit further and show you something else. Jack, can you read that?
Old and modern Hebrew prior to the Babylonian captivity, the Jews used an alphabet very similar to what is found in the Torah scrolls of the Samaritans. However, during the Babylonian captivity, the Jews adopted the Aramaic square script, while Paleo Hebrew was used by Jews into the 1st century AD. Aramaic square script was predominantly used to write Hebrew, and this is the script used in most scrolls found in the Dead Sea.
Now, the Old Testament is written in the 1st century, okay? 1st century. So they were using the old Paleo Hebrew, okay? Now take a look at this. When he opened the 6th seal, Revelation 6:12, Jack, can you read that?
When he opened the 6th seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood.
All right, so here you go. You've got what does that stand for in Old Paleo Hebrew? That's the omega. That's tav, the omega. Okay, you follow me so far? All right, there were 2 earthquakes here. And so that's the sign of the omega. But however, there was a third earthquake, a third eclipse on October 14th, 2023. And that one followed this course. Okay. Now, can you read that, Jack?
This is the third eclipse. The repetition of the number 3 is believed to hold symbolic spiritual meaning. Phrases, objects, and people in groups of 3 are considered prominent and divinely important. If something is complete, it'll be in a group of 3. The number 3 appears in the Bible 467 times.
So it has some significance. Okay. So this is the eclipse. Now I want to combine this with the other one and see if you recognize this. There's the alpha and the omega. The alpha and the omega. See the X right here? The X right here. So this is the omega and this is the alpha, and they're put together just like the other one, alpha and omega. You see that? Yeah.
This is all, what we're looking at is the United States. What about people in Africa, Asia? Are they getting ideas?
Yeah, I don't care about that right now. I'm taking a look at. Well, you can look that up and come back and report next week. But I'm looking at what we've got over the United States, and it sounds like, I mean, this is of course my opinion, but if you combine the pathways of 2017, 2023, 2024, you can clearly see Aleph Tav over our country. And by the way, Aleph Tav, it appears in the Old Testament 9,500 times, but our English translators eliminated it. Okay. And if you put it back in and look at Aleph Tav, it refers specifically to Jesus throughout the Old Testament. And of course, we've been doing studies on the Old Testament and Christ and the gospel in the Old Testament. Okay. How many of you find this interesting? Or I was blown away when I saw this, absolutely blown away. So what's God trying to tell us? Jack, can you read that? That's from Genesis 1. Okay.
Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years.
So it began in the Old Testament, did it not? Okay, if that's not enough, there's more. In addition to all that we have, the Green Devil comet is going to photobomb the eclipse on April 8th. And also, by the way, Little Egypt has just had an earthquake. Now, comets, Jack, can you read that?
Comets have inspired dread, fear, and awe in many different societies around the world, and over time, they've been branded with such titles as the Harbinger of Doom and the Menace of the Universe. They've been regarded both as omens of disaster and messengers of the gods.
Are you still paying attention? Anybody sleeping? All right. So what do we do? What do we do about this? Well, that's good, but there are several things for us to be aware of. First, we have to understand that God is sovereign, right? What do we mean by that? God is sovereign.
Control of everything.
He's in control of everything. He's here. He understands all that's happening. Everything that's happening, he understands. Nothing escapes his notice or his plans. And he's going to act according to his timing. But he will act. Do you believe that? How many believe that? So we should be encouraged by this. Number two, we have to remember God's promises. Now, here are 7 of his promises, but I easily found over 100 promises. And here's a website if you're interested. Okay. Number 3, we have to stand on those promises. God's given us his great and precious promises to give us hope and joy and peace and wisdom and strength, whatever we face during our day. Number 4, we have to do what the Ninevites did. Remember, when Jonah came, what did they do? They repented from their sins and for their sins individually, but also corporately. And they fasted and prayed for 40 days. I'm not suggesting you do that, but fasting and praying is not a bad thing. The king fasted, and so did everyone else. And God relented. One more thing. God gave them 40 days to repent. 40 days from 4/8 is Pentecost. Okay? Now, Jack, can you read Joel?
Joel
2,
2:28.
28 to 31.
And afterward, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord.
What do you think about that? What is God promising? He's going to pour out his spirit, and a lot of people are going to get saved, right? Finally, I love this verse in Luke 21:28. Look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. And all God's people said,
Amen.